Hey everyone! When you think about medieval fashion, what comes to mind? Probably tattered clothes, muddy and dull colors, right? Well, think again. The truth about medieval clothing is far more interesting and diverse than what you might expect. Today, we're going to dive deep into the fashion of the Middle Ages, from peasants to kings, and you'll see just how different it was from the Hollywood portrayals. First things first, clothing in the Middle Ages was a clear marker of social status. When we think of peasants, we picture simple tunics and maybe a dull gray color palette. But that's not the full story. Let's start with the everyday commoners. Peasants, and the working class in general, wore simple clothes made from natural materials like wool and linen. These clothes were mostly practical, designed for work rather than style. You would typically see tunics, often belted at the waist, paired with simple pants or leggings. Colors? While it's true that peasants didn't wear bright, luxurious colors, their clothes were far from the dull, dirty rags often shown in movies. They wore natural tones like brown, gray, and beige, and sometimes these were dyed with plants or minerals to add some variety. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the aristocracy and royalty had an entirely different approach to fashion. Nobles and kings wore garments made from the finest silks, velvets, and furs. Rich, deep colors like purple, red, and blue were reserved for the wealthy because these dyes were incredibly expensive to produce. Their clothing often featured intricate embroidery and decorations made from precious metals, jewels, and beads. Let's now take a deeper look at how fashion differed for men and women in the Middle Ages. While both wore garments that reflected their social status, the style and function of their clothing were distinct. For men, the most common garment was the tunic, typically knee-length, made from wool or linen. The lower classes wore simpler tunics, often in natural, undyed colors. The tunic was paired with hose or leggings, which were practical for both warmth and mobility, especially for workers or soldiers. Women's fashion, on the other hand, was more complex. Women wore long, flowing dresses, often with dramatic sleeves. These dresses were made from finer materials like silk, velvet, and brocade, especially among the nobility. The dresses were often paired with a tightly fitted bodice that accentuated the waist. These gowns were not only luxurious, but also indicated a woman's social rank. The length and fabric of a woman's dress could signify her wealth, with nobility wearing trailing gowns decorated with expensive furs or velvet. Color played a significant role in women's fashion as well. Rich colors like purple, red, and blue were often reserved for the elite because of the expensive dyes used to create them. This added another layer of symbolism, as these colors were associated with royalty or the church. The headgear was also a key distinction. While men's hats were more practical, women wore elaborate headdresses. Nobles wore tall, intricate hats, often adorned with jewels and pearls. These headpieces, such as the hennin, were not only fashionable, but also signaled a woman's status and wealth. Colors and fabrics in medieval fashion weren't just a matter of personal taste. They were a clear reflection of social status. Let's explore how. Certain colors were reserved only for the wealthy, as they were incredibly expensive to produce. For instance, purple dye, made from sea snails, was one of the rarest and most expensive dyes of the time. Because of this, only royalty and high nobility could afford purple garments. Similarly, rich reds and blues, often derived from expensive plant-based dyes or insects like cochineal, were worn by the elite. Fabrics also played a huge role in defining one's status. The wealthiest individuals wore silk, velvet, and fine wool, which were imported or woven from specially raised flocks. These luxurious fabrics were often embroidered with gold and silver thread, further emphasizing wealth. In contrast, lower classes wore simpler, rougher fabrics, like coarse wool and linen, which were practical but far less expensive. In addition to color and fabric, accessories further indicated status. Noblemen and women adorned themselves with intricate jewelry made from precious metals, pearls, and gemstones. They also wore expensive furs, which were used to line cloaks or as decorative trims, signaling their high rank and wealth. The difference in fabric and color was not just about luxury, though. It was a way to communicate one's place in society. The more elaborate the garment, the higher the status of the wearer. In this way, medieval clothing was a clear visual sign of wealth, power, and social hierarchy. When it comes to medieval fashion, hats and accessories were just as important as the clothing itself. They played a significant role in indicating status and personal style, and sometimes even served practical purposes. For men, hats were generally simple, but still had their own flair. Common headgear included hoods, caps, and small, pointy hats. Nobles, however, often wore more elaborate versions of these, sometimes adorned with feathers or jewels. Men of high rank might also wear a crown or a special headdress during ceremonial events. Women's headwear, on the other hand, was much more intricate and varied. One of the most notable pieces was the wimple, a cloth that covered the neck and sometimes the chin, worn by women of higher social status. Over time, this evolved into the hennin, the tall, cone-shaped hat often associated with 15th century fashion. These hats could be so large and elaborate that they required a support frame to keep them upright. The larger the headdress, the higher the rank of the woman wearing it. Jewelry was also an essential accessory. Nobility adorned themselves with items like necklaces, rings, and brooches, often made from precious metals and gemstones. These accessories weren't just for decoration, they were often passed down as family heirlooms and were important symbols of wealth. Even the wealthy middle class could afford simpler jewelry, like brooches or pins made of silver. Belts were another key accessory, worn by both men and women. For nobles, belts were often elaborately decorated with gold or silver buckles, while common folk wore simpler leather belts. These belts were not only decorative but also functional, holding pouches, knives, or other tools. As you can see, the details really mattered. Medieval fashion was not just about the clothes themselves, it was about how they were accessorized. Whether it was a hat, a piece of jewelry, or a finely crafted belt, every accessory helped to tell a story about the wearer's social standing and personal taste. Many of the myths we have about medieval fashion come from movies and popular media, but the reality is often quite different from what we're shown on screen. First, let's talk about the idea that medieval people were dirty and always wore ragged, torn clothes. While it's true that hygiene was different in the Middle Ages compared to today, people still valued cleanliness and took great care of their clothes. Laundry was done, and garments were repaired when needed. The idea that everyone wore tattered rags simply isn't true. Commoners, too, had well-maintained clothing, though it was much simpler and made from more affordable materials. Another misconception is that everyone in the Middle Ages wore dull brown clothes. While it's true that natural fibers often resulted in earthy tones like browns and grays, many people wore clothes dyed in a variety of colors, even peasants. Dyes made from plants, berries, and insects created vibrant hues that could be seen in everyday clothing, even among the lower classes. Finally, there's the myth that medieval people didn't care about fashion. In fact, fashion in the Middle Ages was incredibly important and was used as a way to show one's place in society. Just like today, people paid attention to trends, and what you wore could signal your social rank, profession, and wealth. So, next time you watch a medieval-themed movie, remember that the fashion wasn't as drab as it often seems. The truth is, medieval people cared deeply about their appearance, and their clothing told an important story about their identity and social status. Thanks for watching Warfare Codex. If you enjoyed this journey into history's strangest figures, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more amazing stories. See you in the next one.